So I would maybe like to start with the possibility that Prime Minister Modi is going to be visiting. We believe, obviously, there's still some details to be worked out, but if the visit comes off as planned in the near future, what do you hope to expect from that visit?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me here with this very distinguished gathering and to share the stage with somebody as distinguished as Ambassador Wisner and yourself. He was a legend in India when he was there, and it's an absolute treat to be sharing the stage with him today and to talk about India and the US. It's nice to have an ambassador as a moderator because he knows what we can say and what we can't say. And one of the things I can't tell you is when the visit will take place. So I can't tell you that. What I can tell you is that Prime Minister Modi and President Trump have had 3 very good conversations on the phone. Right the morning after the election, and after the inauguration, and once thereafter. And all the 3 conversations have been very, very friendly, very warm, very constructive, very appreciative of India's role and the potential of India-US engagement. And I think if I was to take a pointer out of that and to say that, there is an invitation which is very much on the table, and when the 2 principals and the leaders meet, I think the idea would be to not only continue what India and the US have been doing, at least for the better part of last 2 decades, but also to see how we can focus our energies much better in alignment with the priorities of the administrations in both countries. So I think there will be a continuation of the relationship, and there would be an impetus on particular things. And I'm happy to go into details whenever you want me to, but I don't want to make this opening pitch a very long one.
Well, we can come back to the issues.
Sure.
Frank, I have just thinking about this. I've had the honor of knowing Ambassador Wisner since I was probably 15 years old, and I remember being invited into the limousine in Cairo and going off and having a hookah, which was quite exciting and inspired me to go pursue a career in diplomacy, because I thought if this is what you get to do, this is pretty interesting. But he was also ambassador, of course, in Cairo, in Zambia, Philippines. Where else? India. Well, of course, India. Of course, India. And but Frank, I wanted to ask you. You've seen the relationship change and develop since you were there, and we've had all of this activity, whether it's the nuclear deal, increased opening for economic and trade ties, but there's still work to be done. There's still opportunity for further growth, and I think I would love to hear your kind of perspective on that, and where are we now, and where do you think we need to go to strengthen the relationship further?
Stuart, thank you, and thank you for a generous, gracious introduction, Ambassador. A treat to be sitting with you here on the stage and to be back in Meridian House. I was reminding Stuart when I came in, I've been in this room before as when it was a dining room, watching then Lally Weymouth marry Ian Weymouth, and the marriage didn't last all that long, but
this one will last longer.
This was all precursor to the terrific institution that Meridian is, and the job, Stuart, that you've done here. I admired and knew your father, and it's a joy to see you managing this terrific enterprise, leading it as you do. I'm glad you started the conversation off as you have, and the ambassador has set the stage rightly. I am very excited about the visit of the Prime Minister, because I believe this is a piece of the architecture of American foreign policy that needs to be gotten right and set in place, and early in this administration. Not that we haven't had a good start years ago when Bill Clinton first visited, and then George W. Bush took his own particular steps, making it clear that a strong India was good for the United States. President Obama made a singular contribution, 2 visits to India, Prime Minister Modi here, but now President Trump has a special opportunity. And it's a good moment to reflect, think for a moment about who we are, where we're going, where we've been, and where we need to get to. A lot of things are absolutely clear. We in India share basic interests, economic, strategic, the values of the two societies. It's also equally obvious to me that India is a rising power on the world stage, and both strategically and economically, India is, I think, the 7th nation GDP, growth fast, strong military, intelligence, diplomatic services. India is a rising power. At the same time, Americans have got to be very careful and not take our assumptions about what's good for the United States and then transfer them to India. India has her own realities, and as President Trump and all of us in this country sit down and think about where we're going in the future, we need to be very careful. We understand exactly. First of all, India is a rising power, but it's not yet a great power. It's on its way, but it has a lot of building to do. Its economic strength is gathering, but even by 2050, India will represent about 7% of global GDP. So it's a long economic course. Our military forces are terrific for the defense of India, but they don't project power in the classic sense of a great power, though India is modernizing her military and will be a significant force in her region. These facts need also to be kept in mind when you think about India. India will go at a relationship with the United States in a very careful way. She won't be looking for an alliance. She'll be looking for a partnership, ways to work together. And as long as we make it clear, and we're clear in our own minds, that India will operate with many of her own assumptions. She will be cautious about the decisions she makes. She has her own institutions, her parliament, her politics. She's got to worry about 1.3 billion people who need to be fed. She's got to look at her region, which is her principal focus. So she'll take these attitudes to the table. And if we don't understand that and make assumptions that India isn't what we think it is, we will make mistakes. So I want us to be realistic, as well as gripping the promise. Now, if we do that, then I think there are a couple of things I'd want to see happen in this administration. I'd like first and foremost for the president to say to Mr. Modi, this is a key relationship with the United States. It is of strategic significance. We are going to continue to build it. We are going to make sure that the building is done in a manner that is even asymmetrical. That is, we may have to put more in before we get much out. It should not be a one-for-one transactional arrangement, because a strong India, as George W. Bush made it clear in his time, Stuart, a strong India is good for the United States. India's strength is good for us in maintaining a balance of power in Asia and the world economic situation. A strong India is good for us. Now, there are a lot of practical things the president can then get on and deal with. We've got a good pattern in defense cooperation. We have some trade issues to sort out. We can talk about those if they're on people's minds. I think they're manageable. We need to get our heads together on China. The rise of Chinese power is as much an issue for India as is for us. Pakistan, the kind of restraint we need to exercise on Pakistan to be a responsible player in the region, and the restraint we our dealings with Pakistan, where we now have pressing interests. Afghanistan. These are all questions that we can tackle. So I think there's a lot to fill up a meeting in the Oval Office with, but the most important thing is to write a bit of a roadmap that says to the two governments, once again, let's renew this association. We're not going to be allies in some classic sense, but we can be very important to each other and key partners.
Thank you, Frank. I do recall, I think both President Clinton, President Bush, and President Obama have all moved that relationship forward. And I do recall sitting in the governor's mansion in Austin as the governor was beginning to learn about the strategic relationships that were important. And he very clearly said, we need to get our relationship with India right. And that was something which he understood as a logical framework and a basis for really prosperity and security. You talk about values. The French, for example, talk about liberty, égalité. We talk about individual freedom, tolerance, rule of law. What does it mean when we talk about those values that we share? What are the values that you see in India that you think are the basis for us having more in common than we do that separate us?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that, but may I just
absolutely
take
on the visit
one of the on the relationship which Ambassador Wisner mentioned. I think a very important point which he made and which I'd like to just stress is the word that he used, partnership. I think ultimately that is perhaps, to my mind, the best way to describe and qualify this relationship, because it's very difficult to see where does India fit in with the US if you look at it only in the classical sense. If you say, okay, they are not NATO allies, they are not non-NATO, they are not in that sense classical allies, they are not part of any umbrella, they are not part, so most of the countries around which the US has been having very significant relationships tend to fall in one basket or the other. But India's relationship is in many ways a sui generis sort of relationship, because India is sui generis. And this is the partnership of two countries who have a lot to offer each other at the moment. I think that is the sort of perspective that if you put that spotlight on the relationship, you tend to get the most out of it. And then that governs how you treat each other, how you relate to each other, how you plan to move ahead together. And frankly, and I'd segue into your question, I think it's very difficult to think of another partner for India, which is such a thriving and huge democracy with very deep democratic roots. Whether it is in the construction and structure of our constitution, similarities of our fundamental rights with the Bill of Rights, whether it is in the rule of law, freedom of speech, the judicial system, the federal structure of India, the necessity of carrying people with you in terms of if you have so many states, and states have their own legislative functions and capabilities and preserves, then how does a country work through all this together? If you're looking at that sort of partner who understands these, then I don't think, frankly, on the scale of India, there is any other in the world. If you're looking at a partner who has an open, liberalizing economy, which is still growing at any rate between 6 and 7%, we can quibble about the decimal point, but that's where we are. A country which has more than 800 million people under the age of 35, a country which has very aspirational, energetic, and talented youth, a country where English language is fairly widely understood. I don't think you can find too many partners of that level and scale. And that is perhaps the kind of thinking that I think a lot of people in the US have understood. Frankly, going back from the time of President Clinton's visit to India and all that was done under President Bush, and then the meetings and the summits with President Obama, and then the continuation in the last 6 months over telephone conversations.
And the Congress, Congressman Royce, for
this
example.
This is
it's not just the executive branch.
No. This is the important point. It is a very wide relationship, and when you go to the Congress, Congressman Royce has been a champion of India-US relations. You find a bipartisan support. I mean, I can share with you that I would have called on perhaps in the last 6 months anything over 50 congressmen and senators, and I don't think I could talk of one meeting in which I didn't get a completely positive welcome and a conversation which was forward-looking.
And it's interesting just to reflect on the fact that now you have these rising Indian politicians, Indian-American politicians here on both sides of the aisle. So you have, Bobby Jindal and Nikki Haley, and then we have Ami Bera and others. And it's not monolithic. It's rich. It's diverse. But Frank, if I could ask you, what I heard the ambassador saying, which was very interesting, which is actually, we think of this non-aligned movement, and India is sort of an architect of this idea of not being in one camp or the other camp. And maybe being honest with each other in a relationship versus having unrealistic expectations of being within NATO and burden sharing and not living up to the special relationship between England and the United States that's supposed to be there. That because we have this relationship based on mutual interest, maybe that's the best kind of relationship to have. What do you think?
Stuart, I'm with you. That's exactly it. But it takes a moment of mature reflection. It doesn't spring naturally from the American habit of looking at national interests and figuring out how they mesh with another nation and how we find balance with another society whose historical and cultural traditions are still, as much as the ambassador is quite correct in how much identity there is, but then we're also very diverse in our approaches. There's a factor that you just began to touch on that helps in the bridge that you're building, and that is the fascinating Indian-American community, which is very powerful.
And how many do we count among that?
I think about 3 million.
3 million.
I would say 2, but the ambassador's got a better figure. But
he's looking.
Say that and pause for a moment. I think almost in any year you've got 80 to 100,000 Indian students in American universities. Think of the huge transfer of experience, of insight, of societal identity that occurs between our two countries. It's almost unique in the world in that particular dimension.
And if you're looking at the overall relationship, I think we've talked about the administration and the Congress and the diaspora or the Indian American community, students. I think we can't forget over the last 15, 20 years the role that's been played by industry. And I think the industry is both, there are almost every major American company is invested in India to a very remarkable degree. And what people may know less is that a large number of Indian corporates are invested in the United States and are investing money in technology and also sharing very highly skilled professionals, which frankly are a crucial factor in making American companies globally competitive.
So we're going to talk a little bit later more specifically on economic issues, but because we also have this cultural element to it. Ambassador, as I recall, you've written a book or two, correct?
Yes.
And I found it fascinating, A, that you would have had time to do this, but B, that you chose to write about subjects that are really more, revealing about culture. And I was wondering if maybe you could share a little bit about what led you to write your book and what it's about.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, taking me off the hook, and now I can talk of things which I don't have to worry about.
Well, we can always go back.
But no, it's all right. Yes, I like our keynote speaker of this evening, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. I'm one of his admirers, as in his writer capacity, and many others. Certainly, as a writer, I always looked up to him, and I did begin my writing early on in my career as a short story writer and as a novelist, and then some amount of nonfiction. So that's just been a night job, so to speak. I have to keep protecting my reputation to make sure people don't say, "Oh, you write because you don't have enough work," which is a dangerous presumption.
And your nonfiction book was what? Was it a poetry?
No, I've done 3 or 4 nonfiction books. I've done 2 major translations. I've done a book on Indians at Herod's Gate, which is the connection of, it's a travel narrative on the Indian historical connection to Jerusalem, something which is not very much known. I've done a collection of essays on writers and books and, as the publishers prefer to call it, the writerly life.
By the way, Sashi's going to tell us later why Indians like P.G. Wodehouse, which we're going to hear.
Yes, I think Indians love P.G. Wodehouse, and I'll leave Shashi to talk about it as a patron of the P.G. Wodehouse Society. But I must tell you that while in my days in the UK, I think the biggest treat that I had was spending a weekend at P.G. Wodehouse's grandson's farm. He's the son of his adopted daughter, and so he gave me a weekend with Wodehouse's archives and in his study, and it was something which dreams are made of. Much of those archives have now moved to the British Library. But I think as if you're asking me in terms of culture and diplomacy, which I think is one of the themes for this afternoon's discussion, I have always felt that as a practicing diplomat, that we very often tend to give short shrift to that part of our job. And I think it's criminal to ignore that, because actually that is the ballast of a relationship. That is the insurance policy of the relationship. Because in any relationship, you will have days and years in which your political barometer will go up and down. The economics will change. But if you have the cultural links which are strong and abiding, then that relationship is safe.
So I know we're getting a little short on time for this panel, but Frank, I wanted to ask you, there's some legendary stories about you getting up close and personal with local cultures as a young diplomat around the world, whether it's, in Bedouin attire, streaking across the desert, or in Vietnam out there. But in India, when you got there, you hadn't served. Had you served in India before?
No.
Okay, so how did you, it's a vast country, how did you sort of approach getting an understanding of India when you got there? And what was something that sort of surprised you that you didn't know about India before you went?
I was actually very fortunate that my introduction to India was not from India, but I arrived in the brand new American embassy in Bangladesh just after its war of independence. And so I was exposed immediately to a variety of hugely important questions about that country, about the war that had taken place between India and Pakistan, about my own country's role, the perception of that role. And it was like sort of getting your primary and secondary education very quickly. But I know when I left with a view that American foreign policy had to get its mind around the fact of India as a power, India as a key player on the world stage. And if you go back to that point, we had very few deep connections with India in a political sense. When the president asked me to serve in India, I arrived believing I had something that was very important to do, and that was to take Washington as best I could forward to an appreciation of just how important in the architecture of American foreign policy India needed to be. We were nailed on a cross of non-proliferation in those days. Our relationship was stymied, and we were able eventually to break loose. But it was only because the idea of the importance drove me as an ambassador to find other allies. Happily, I found one in President Clinton who looked around and he saw nearly 1 billion voters out there, and he said, that's my kind of place. So I had an ally in the White House and was able to jump over the bureaucracy. But that experience taught me, and has remained my lodestar, if you will, since, the strategic significance of this relationship. And I believe it today. It's changed, it's acquired fresh trappings, it's given me confidence whenever we run up against an H-1B visa problem or a crisis over intellectual property rights, or a difference of view over Pakistan, or an inadequacy of our ability to express ourselves about China or Afghanistan. We can overcome these because behind it lies this core reality. These are two countries with common interests, and those interests are profound. They are truly strategic in nature.
And I think it's also a reflection of the importance of relationship that we've had people like you, Frank, and I think Tim Romer was here, Ambassador Romer. I'm not sure if he's still here. But when you think about it, John Kenneth Galbraith, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, these were significant figures. I'm sure I'm leaving a number of them out as our ambassadors to India. So there must have been some betting on the come, as it were, that this was going to be the relationship, right?
I can't resist telling you a minor anecdote. I had the privilege of meeting John Kenneth Galbraith when I was a young man. My parents happened to have been friends of his. And so when I was asked, Ambassador, to go to India, I called him on the telephone. And I said, I really want to just tell you that at some distance removed, I'm going to be walking in your august footsteps. It was a complete silence. And I waited, and I said, but Mr. Ambassador, and more silence. And then I said, Dr. Galbraith, still silence. Ken, I said. And then I heard a voice clear, and he said, Frank, he said, welcome to a life sentence. And he was absolutely right.
Great. Well, Ambassador Wisner, Ambassador Sarna, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you.